India, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. International Women's Day 2019 here in London, and the inaugural launch of Limitless, our Leaders' Lunch for Women in Business and Technology. And I'm really keen to ask you a series of questions, and I'm hopeful of your great generosity in sharing with us your insight. My first question is, what is the best career advice that you've been given?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting one. The best career advice I've been given is probably around being authentic, and that you can only really be who you are. And if you try to be anything else, it shines through, though you may not understand that that's what's happening. So I would say authenticity. And I would say the other one, which is like this golden gem that one of my bosses gave me one time, was because I used to always wonder how he was able to go into meetings and get outcomes like with no effort. And it was always about the meeting before the meeting, like understanding how to build consensus before you step into a room.
That's great advice, and I think that socialising beforehand is really helpful. I think we'll certainly be taking that on board. Randy Zuckerberg this week was reported in the press as kind of calling out the challenges of entrepreneurship, and I know that you're a very successful entrepreneur and have had a very extensive career in that. She talks about family and friends and career and gym and life and sleep, and says that you can realistically only fit 3 in. They're tough choices when we aspire to have everything and have it all. What's your take on that?
You can't have it all. And I think that even 3 might be generous. I think it's kind of like I find myself at 1 and everything else kind of falling by the wayside at any given point. But I will say, it's such a journey. And I always tell people who are interested in becoming entrepreneurs that it is so not for the faint of heart, because you really have to be prepared for the lows. So in addition to the juggle, it is the uncertainty and knowing that if you don't kill it, you don't eat, and so that in addition to the pressures of trying to balance, family and work and clients and gym and anything else that you might want to do, friends or whatever it might be, takes its toll, but on the other side, it's tremendously rewarding. I had a conversation with somebody recently. She was saying, I stepped out and I realized how many people only really paid attention to me because of my title. And so, and I experienced that, and she and I had this conversation 3 years ago, and I was telling her how I stepped out of JP Morgan and suddenly people just kind of fell by the wayside. Like they don't answer the calls anymore. They're not as interested anymore. And she is having that experience now. But what happens on the other side is I'm here on my own terms. Like I'm here and people are responding to me and I know it's about me and what I really bring in terms of value to the table and not about the organization. So I think the balance thing is, being able to kind of stand in your humility and know that that you can't do everything all the time, and that sometimes you just have to make choices.
Again, great advice. And I think one of the things that just listening to your response there that made me question is that it's when women get to a position of influence and leadership and perhaps have that title that's very deserved and they're getting recognized, that journey to that stage is one where how do you create influence when you perhaps haven't got the title? How do you get that leverage? And I think many young leaders will be keen to hear what tips and advice you can give there.
Gosh, I would say that people that I've experienced who have a lot of influence without title have great networks. It's about being able to influence people even if you're not in a role. And that is best done by ensuring that you have great networks. And so, spending the time to get to know people and what they do and the value they bring is, I think, critically important in terms of driving influence. And, for young folks coming up through the chain, I remember, for myself even, when I was coming up, it's one of those things that kind of seems to evade you. It's kind of like, how do I get to that place? And for women particularly who don't necessarily have the role models in place, all around, it can be a little challenging because when nobody who looks like you is doing it, it can be hard. And so I would say spend the time building your network, and every person. It isn't just the senior people, it is every person, because today's analyst is tomorrow's CEO, right? So building those relationships and valuing people for who they are and not worrying about what they do today, but knowing that eventually they may land somewhere that could be helpful to you is really important. So I would say influence is about network, truly. And even now, even though I was very senior in my corporate career, my network is the thing that got me through when I stepped out.
And you still continue to support and service your network.
Absolutely.
One of the things I found was interesting, and that is, so Thoughtworks as an organisation, we're non-hierarchical. So therefore that, influence doesn't come through title. I think we respond very well to the suggestions there that socialising things in advance, working through a network, building your social capital, building your credibility amongst your peer group in order to get advocacy is really important. You also touched on and mentioned that, looking around and not seeing people who look like you. And, as women in business, there are fewer of us. You've done an awful lot of great work in the BAME community as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about, being an underrepresented minority within an underrepresented minority? I mean, that's a challenge, and one that, I know that many women want to continue to support and advocate. So give us some tips and advice as to how we can support fellow colleagues.
That's really interesting because, I certainly in the investment banking world was a bit of a unicorn. But what that did, there was a lot of pressure actually, because I felt a huge responsibility to women, and I also felt a huge amount of responsibility to the BAME community in terms of providing some kind of thought leadership and role modeling for how people could get to the next thing. And I will be honest that, probably towards the end of my career, I was completely fatigued from being kind of the poster girl for all of those things. But again, still it was a responsibility. I would say that for BAME communities specifically, it really is about having the dialogue. So for example, and I say this to people, and it seems really simple, but most folks, particularly in the UK, who are the BAME community of my age, are first generation. Like their parents came from wherever it might be. And a lot of people came over in the 50s and 60s, our parents, and they did jobs that were tenured. So it could be, nurse or teacher or work in factories or whatever it might be. But you do a great job and you move on to the next level, right? The corporate world is not that. It's not only that, right? There are so many other things that go around it, but the models that we had were keep your head down, do a great job, and you'll move to the next thing. So a part of it is celebrating our successes and understanding the bicultural competency around corporate culture, which is very different than any of us were raised in. And so I think that organizations can go some way to understanding that BAME communities, I think most of the immigrant BAME communities anyway, operate differently and through a different lens. And so I think the understanding that it's a different lens and that people who are keeping their head down and doing a good job is not because they don't want to move on, it's because that's what they were taught to do to move on, is a really important thing to understand. And so I think a lot of the challenges that BAME people face is around things like that. But I also think that there are very direct measures that organizations can take in increasing the numbers. But you have to be bold about it and you have to step out and do it. And it's difficult, right? Because getting the balance right is important. And then the role modeling, right? It's making sure that people, again, see people who look like them. And my entire career, I didn't. However, what I will say is that being said, my greatest role models were white men because that's all there was. And they were amazing. Amazing men who pushed me in ways that I wouldn't have pushed myself, who challenged me. So whilst I'd love to see somebody who looks like me, I also want women and folks, BAME folks, to understand that there are amazing role models. And so start to look for the qualities that people have that you want to emulate as opposed to only people who look like you, because kind of true diversity comes in that.
So it's actually also about the characteristics that you can align to. It's really important. So we're here today celebrating International Women's Day 2019. Awesome. And I've seen it over the years move to an International Women's Week and a month of celebration. When do we get to the point where it's 24/7, 365 and we're not actually singling it out as hey, let's celebrate women for these 28 days? And it's more than that.
We have so much work to do. We have so much work to do. If you look at some of the numbers in terms of the point at which women get parity in the workplace, it's a long ways away. Like 100 years, if at the same rate. It's kind of crazy. There's some work that's been done in terms of gender pay equity, but not enough. And, if you're talking about the UK, I think the UK is frankly, despite all the things that are happening, ahead of the curve in terms of pushing folks to have the conversations, whereas, in the US where I spend a lot of my time, they're not in the same way. And so I think that that we just have a long way to go, and that, hopefully, I think that it's incumbent upon us to make it 365, 24/7. And I think for most of us who kind of are focused on ensuring that those things happen, it is. But it is nice to be able to celebrate and to kind of, roll out the red carpet for all the women who work so hard at all levels of organizations, from the woman who, is at reception to the woman who's in the boardroom. It's an amazing time to be able to celebrate what we've accomplished and achieved. And so I think that's what we do in the meantime.
So I think what I take from that conversation is that, we've got regulatory pressures in the UK, and good that we have something that's directing businesses to take more responsibility on pay equality and pay equity. And then, of course, you also touched on having advocates in your business and in your workplace and in your network, and having male colleagues who will be advocates for women within their teams, their organizations, etc. is really important. How do we encourage more men to be feminists?
It's a really difficult time for men, actually, for two reasons. One is I think that in some ways there are a lot of folks who are disenfranchised by early diversity kind of movements and initiatives. I think that for men it's challenging and can be a little bit scary because you don't want to overstep and it be misconstrued in some ways too. But I think that I try to remind men that, you have daughters, you have wives, you have mothers. Like, that's kind of where it started. What would you want for her? And that's a baseline question. What would you want for your mother or your wife or your daughter? Wouldn't you want them to step out and have all the power in the world just because? And, for most men, it's yes. It's I don't know how. And so I think kind of giving people the tools and having the conversations, but also understanding that whilst it may not be ideal, that, it's still a man's world, men still have all the power, frankly. And that shifting that power isn't easy. And for them, the kind of internal turmoil that they feel as things are moving, it's uncomfortable. And so whilst I don't think we have to mollycoddle people through that process, I think that we need to understand it. And that, we can go some way to translating that and being supportive around how we help people get to that.
That's interesting. And I think, to talk about the discomfort that I think is happening in society and that paradigm shift and that change, nobody wants anybody to be going through a period of lack of comfort, but there's a parallel that says minorities, women, gender groups, etc., have been experiencing microaggressions for ever. I've been in industry for 35 years, and you similarly. It is getting better, but by goodness, it seems to be slow. Absolutely. And I just wonder how we can accelerate that. I know that you do an awful lot of great coaching work, a lot of pro bono work as well. The paying back and paying it forward, what kind of initiatives can people get involved in?
So I think that, there are so many. There are so many folks who are out here doing really, really good work. And I think it depends on what your mantle is. And when I say that, there are some folks who are really focused on women on boards. There are some folks who are really focused on just kind of numbers of women in organizations. There are some folks that are focused on, human rights as it relates to women. And there are loads of wonderful organizations to address each of those things. And so I think a part of this is understanding that service is really important. It's why we're here. And that whilst we all have jobs and we're kind of going into the workplace, the reality is if we're not serving our communities, then we're doing a disservice to our countries. And we all need to be doing something around helping to shift the narrative. And it doesn't matter how small. It could be something, it could be going and reading to young girls in schools. It could be, tutoring. It could be, advocacy. It could be anything, but it's about us all doing something in service. And so, I challenge and encourage people to serve your community, serve, things that are important to you, and go out and spend the time, because if we don't, we see what can happen as is happening around the world. Unfortunately for women and girls, we're going backwards in some ways. And a part of that is due to some of the political issues that are happening in a number of Western countries. And so it's incumbent upon us to ensure that we make sure that doesn't happen, and that we don't expect government to resolve the things that we need to resolve in our communities, and that we actively engage as citizens to ensure that we get the outcomes that we want. We can't rely on other people to do it. anymore. It used to be that we might have been able to exert pressure in certain places, but I think it requires a lot more grassroots, hands-on work from normal citizens as opposed to expecting other folks to do it.
So women doing it for themselves.
Absolutely.
And embracing male advocates as well.
I mean, we need people to do the work, don't get me wrong. We still need government to play their part, but I think increasingly we're moving into a space where we need folks to come back and do the work.
Speak up.
Speak up.
Take action. India, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. It's a pleasure.